All right, when I started my last head of growth gig at Postscript about 5 years ago, I remember feeling super excited and super nervous at the same time. Now, I wasn't new to growth. I had been working in growth for about 5 years before that. I had started and scaled the growth team at Wistia. I had gone from acquisition marketer eventually to director of growth, overseeing a true cross-functional product-led growth team. But I was brand new to working in growth at Postscript. It was a new environment, a new culture, much smaller organization, different levels of ownership and accountability. And I was walking in with a clean slate. Right at Wistia, I had a bunch of wins on the board. I had been promoted a few times and everyone kind of understood my reputation and my intentions. But suddenly I was going to a brand new environment. I didn't have a bigger team like what I had before. I was a team of one again. And I was stressed trying to figure it all out and build something new from scratch. I was excited to put my stamp on the org. And I was itching to get some W's and show everybody how smart they were for hiring me and what an A player I was going to be. But I knew that I didn't want to come in too hot. I didn't want to step on somebody's toes or some team's toes before I got the lay of the land culturally and before I could identify where to focus and where the leverage was. Now, what I realized is that nobody teaches you how to approach this phase, the first 90 days. And almost every single person who I coach today tells me they wish they had some type of blueprint or guidance. It's exactly what I'm going to share with you here. Today, I'm chatting with Jay Desai. He just joined Navattic as their growth lead 30 days ago. So what you're going to hear is a real conversation helping Jay fine-tune his 90-day plan. So if you have just started a new gig or you're thinking about making a move in 2026, or maybe you just want to be more prepared the next time that you do switch teams, you're going to love this conversation. If you haven't already, please remember to subscribe. There's going to be a downloadable free workbook if you want to grab it to help you navigate your own 90-day plan. All right, enough from me. Let's jump in and hear from Jay.
So my official title is growth lead at a company called Navattic. We're a team of 3 as a marketing team, and we operate, I think, a little bit differently than maybe some other marketing teams in the sense of we don't have dedicated lanes. Like I'm not doing just like product marketing or like content marketing or performance marketing or something like that. We're kind of like co-owning the function essentially. So that's pretty cool. Prior to Navattic, I've done a few different things. I was working on my own product for a little bit as well. I was also the head of marketing of this recruiting company, actually. I was the only non-recruiter on the team and basically in charge of everything marketing. It was my 3rd time being the first marketing hire. Previous 2 times before that were in software. And I actually had a couple of offers that were in software that were competing for this last role I was in. But I'm very much a big believer of picking companies to work for where I believe in the problem they're solving, believe in the founding team, especially since I've worked a lot of early stage roles, and I believe in the product or service that's being offered. So those are some really big things. And that's kind of what brought me to my last role versus being in software. But now I'm back in software. So excited to be here and excited to chat.
And so what does growth lead mean at Navattic? This is one of the things I'll talk about a ton with clients and with folks who I meet kind of in the wild. Growth means something totally different in different environments, in different go-to-market models, in different companies, at different moments in companies. What does it mean to Navattic in your role today?
Yeah, so I think when I think about growth at Navattic and what that role kind of means is we are looking to improve, like grow out essentially our customer user base and our revenue. So anything that basically helps to improve that metric, that's kind of what we're doing. Any activity that we're doing, we're kind of downstreaming that to that main metric. But there's a bunch of different ways to do that, right? Those things can be, either helping to run some strategies or campaigns around user acquisition, helping to improve even within the product, engagement, those kinds of things, adoption, usage, those things. I think it even encompasses things around internal enablement as well to help us kind of report on what we're doing and find ways to potentially improve what we're doing or create new hypotheses that we can test and do. So anything that kind of helps to grow the business. Now, obviously, this isn't a sales function, so I'm not like closing deals or anything, but hey, what can we do to essentially queue up the business and put it in such a position where we're in the right places, we're in front of the right potential users, we're helping our existing customers, we're growing that base as well, engaging that base and doing all of those things. So It's pretty, and I'm sure as you know, pretty ambiguous of a role in terms of what types of projects I'm doing, but I'm sure we'll touch in depth a little bit more about that. But anything that I can do to help support us get in front of more prospective users or increase our engagement within our customers is kind of what I'm touching.
Yeah. And it's like a classic early stage growth role where your job is to help the business grow. There's a million different levers. And in theory, you could focus on all of them or none of them. And the exciting part of the job is that it's so wide open. And then also kind of the scary part of the job is that it's so wide open. And so I don't mean to project, but I've just seen this pattern a bunch of times. I would imagine it's a little bit of that, which is like the fun part of working in growth is like figuring all this stuff out, which is why I'm excited to chat with you about this today, because the first 90 days helps everybody get on the same page for what you might be focusing on and how you might be operating and who you might be collaborating with and all that good stuff. So first 90 days, critical to the long-term success for these kinds of gigs.
100%. It defines the function and kind of what's going to be done moving forward.
Yeah. And so before we get into 90-day plan, just for the folks who are listening to this, tell us what feels familiar about this role as you kind of enter into this new opportunity, and then maybe what's a little bit scary or exciting or a little bit unfamiliar for this new gig.
Yeah, what feels super familiar for me, I think regardless of whether you're doing marketing for a product or a service, the levers to an extent are pretty similar. There's a couple of nuances, obviously, between product versus service. But in that sense, what feels really familiar to me, as usual, is doing things like, content marketing, helping that function out, field and event marketing, even paid advertising, email a little bit. What feels a little bit, I wouldn't say unfamiliar to me, but it's kind of something that I'm relearning a little bit over here is, obviously my last company I was at, the product was people. So there wasn't necessarily really a sense of like, there was some degree of product marketing, I guess, but not really. So having to kind of relearn that muscle and reawaken that muscle. I was also working on a startup on the side that I had as a weekend project at the same time. So that kind of helped me keep some of those product marketing skills sharp, but this is on a different level. Obviously, you're not playing in the same arena of doing a side project versus a business that has, almost like 50 employees at this point. So it's just different scales in that sense. And then what else kind of feels unfamiliar to me too is I think orienting myself around what type of resources and tools I have available. It's a little bit different again from the services space where you have a service, right? But now we've got a product. So there's a lot of product analytics tools that we're using, ways to track users, other metrics that are very concrete in terms of what we're doing. It's very easy to kind of track some of that user funnel and user journey a little bit more easily. And then the other thing too is, my last company, everyone was a recruiter, like I mentioned, and I was the only marketing person. We didn't have a sales team. The salesperson was our founder. And so working back with a sales team and kind of getting that motion going again is definitely something I'm becoming a little bit more comfortable to. And it's really just a muscle awakening exercise versus a muscle building exercise here, but I'm excited for it.
Heck yeah, man. And if we were to think about your first 90 days as a project, how would you know if you fucking nail it? Like, what does good look like if this first 90 days, this first couple months goes almost perfectly? I don't want to say perfectly because there's no perfect, but like, what does good look like here? How do you think about that?
So when I think about good for coming into a new growth role or any type of marketing role, especially in an early stage organization, I think it's the amount of impact that you're able to generate and get some quick wins on the board. I like to have at least 2 to 3 projects that I can say at the end of my 90 days that, hey, these were really, not anything super short-term projects, but bigger projects essentially that I can say, hey, this helped to improve some sort of process or create some sort of efficiency, something that we can really point to towards metrics. A really good example, and I'm sure we'll get into some more projects as we go, but for instance, one of the projects that I'm tackling first is, our content strategy in terms of our website, traditional like blog content, those kinds of things has been a little bit more manual than maybe some other organizations. And so taking that process and kind of creating a little bit more time efficiency in that process, essentially, And in terms of how we're tracking that, right? Like we can look at that and say like, hey, when we first started, here's how much content we were producing. Here's how long it was taking us to produce. And then, as we kind of complete a project around that specifically, we want to look back at that and say, okay, did we either increase, like improve the amount of content we can generate? So it basically, are we able to scale this program? Or B, were we able to create some sort of time efficiency in terms of our process and kind of like reduce that? And obviously C being the best of both, which is both items, right? Like if we're able to do that. And so I think having just a couple of projects that you can really point to and say like, hey, here's what I put together and here's how we improved things from either a time efficiency standpoint or scaling some sort of function or project that we had before. Those are some things that I am really kind of looking for. I know that's maybe a little bit more subjective, but hopefully that can add some layer of like objectiveness to it to how I think about it.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to know, right? Because in the first 90 days, obviously you want to get some wins on the board, but you also have to be realistic, right? You're still learning. You're kind of in this information gathering period, and a lot of it is kind of setting the foundation for future stuff. So I appreciate like the mix of both wins and process and learning. And again, I want to unpack all this with you. And before we do, what about on the flip side? Like if we were to fast forward to the end of this 90 days or maybe 3-6 months out, if this doesn't go well, what would that story look like? Like how do we know what to avoid along this journey as well as you kind of get going and you get up to speed?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that you want to avoid, especially out of all outcomes, is when you're at that 90-day mark, that when, if someone's asking you, hey, what are the major projects or things that you've completed? Were you able to create some sort of measurable impact, or what was the outcome? I think the worst case scenario is you have nothing that you could say like, hey, I came here and I built this and I put this in place. And then I would say this is kind of like a medium case scenario in the sense of you wouldn't necessarily want this outcome. It's not the ideal outcome, but in the sense of, hey, maybe you did try a few projects and none of them were able to create any sort of measurable outcome, because obviously this is a growth role, right? So you're going to be experimenting. You're going to be trying projects. You're going to see what works. You have a hypothesis. You have some sort of data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, that you're kind of putting in here. And that's why you're doing the things that you're doing. But that's another scenario that you can end up at. But hopefully, even if all things really just caught on fire and didn't work out, at least hopefully you're landing in a situation of like, hey, here are the things that, we tried and we implemented. This is why we tried them. And then you have some sort of at least postmortem information of these didn't work and this is why this didn't work. But what you really want to avoid, I think, in terms of what's a really negative outcome is, not having anything on the board that you can kind of point to, or, not having any sort of, hey, I published or I created or I pushed and launched a few things, but you also maybe can't tell that story of like what the actual outcome is. And there's no sort of, analysis to that in terms of what you're doing. So those are the kind of like red flags that I like to avoid. But, I think the big thing is coming out, publishing some work, creating some quick wins, creating what you can do. And I kind of look at, this is something that I look at very specifically, which is I try and look for this Goldilocks zone of work to be done in the first 90 days, which is, I think tasks that fall into this Goldilocks zone, this project or experiment Goldilocks zone, are essentially ones that they meet two requirements. One, it's something that is important enough that can create a measurable impact at the company. So something that's kind of needed. You've identified a gap that you need. And then the second thing that I think is important in this Goldilocks zone for these projects that you want to work on is projects that align with your skill set. So you talked about earlier, like what's familiar and what's unfamiliar. I like to pick projects at least early on that I have some sort of familiarity in the space. And I feel like I don't want to call myself an expert, but I have some sort of level of expertise to that function or how that works. And so picking some projects that, I know can impact the company really well and that I'm also really strong in terms of skills. Those are the projects that I want to be working on early on.
Have you heard of the concept task relevant maturity? It comes from a famous management book called High Output Management, written by this guy, Andy Grove, who used to work at IBM and kind of our parents' era of tech. Have you heard of that before?
I have it.
I'll give you the TLDR. So the general idea, and this was kind of a learning to me, I think a lot of new managers kind of think that I'm either going to be like the hands-off manager or I'm going to try to avoid being like the micro manager, or sort of like the two extreme versions of it. And this framework kind of introduces the idea that there's no employee that needs to be micromanaged. There's no employee that needs to be totally hands-off, that it's all about how much task relevant experience you have, or maturity might be a different way. And it's a great way to manage yourself and what you need from others. And kind of what I'm hearing you say is, what I try to do in the first 90 days is find things that I have a high amount of task relevant maturity in and front load a bunch of that stuff so I can get momentum, get a little bit of confidence, teach others kind of what I'm all about and how I'm going to work, and maybe have an environment for me to collaborate with some of those folks that I already feel very confident in, and save some of those things I have a little less task relevant maturity and a little less experience in for once I get that momentum. And I think that's a great framework.
Yeah, that's exactly how I try and approach any sort of new role. I kind of call it, for marketing, safety net marketing, where you want to create this safety net for yourself in your new role, so that way you feel like, hey, at least I have a few wins that I can kind of point to. And I think those actually give you the highest opportunity to generate those quick wins that you're looking for in the first 90 days.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this episode of the show. If you are, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening on. The data shows something like 40% of the people who listen to the show are actually subscribed. It is the best way for you to support the show, and it helps the algorithm find other listeners who are just like you. If you're feeling generous, a quick rating or review makes a huge difference as well. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. Now let's get back to this episode. All right, so I've helped a bunch of folks with their first 90-day plan. And actually, I'll put a link in the show notes of this conversation to the actual 90-day plan if folks want to download it and use it, whether they're starting a new role today or maybe just gearing up for when that time comes. I'll put a link to that so you can download it for free in the show notes. But the TLDR is that I think great 90-day plans have 5 different vectors. And I want to explore these with you. But for the listeners, we've got focused learning. So putting together your own learning roadmap that includes things about your business, about the users, about the growth model, about the company's cultural norms, all that kind of stuff. Second would be building trust and alignment. Basically, trust being forming relationships with your cross-functional partners. Alignment being getting clarity on ownership and accountability for your role, which we talked about a little bit already. Third is setting up your operating system. So introducing the way that you're going to go about your work, how your standard operating procedure might be for experiments or for tracking or for communication and sharing, all that kind of stuff. Fourth is getting some quick W's on the board, which we talked about. And the fifth is planting some seeds for longer term bets. So I want to explore this with you. Let's start with learning. So I'm curious for you, as you think about these first 90 days, things that you need to learn to get up to speed to be really effective quickly. What's top of the list? Like what's on that 90-day learning roadmap, and maybe what's at the top of the list and being sequenced first versus things that you can save for later?
Yeah, I think the number one thing probably, and I'm curious to see what other people think about this as well, but my number one thing is familiarity with the product or service you're selling. That's like the number one thing that's on the top of my list. And I try and build as much depth in that space as possible during the first 90 days. I think it's a little bit easier to build depth in the first 90 days because there is a level of grace that's kind of allowed to say, hey, this is your first 90 days. We want you to be able to learn, get familiar with what we're selling, even if you have some familiarity already. I think people want you to spend time doing that. Those are things that are really important. So that's always at the top of my list.
How do you go about doing that? So for folks listening to this, like probably nodding their head, yes, Jay, definitely you should be doing that, getting depth in the product. How are you doing this at Navattic?
Yeah, I think first, number one, it depends on your learning style. I think you should definitely take that into account and really think about how you prefer to learn. For me, the way that I do this is I like to learn hands-on. I like to be in the product. So what that means is I have a Navattic account set up. I'm going in the product. I'm building out interactive demos. I'm going in and maybe breaking some things and just kind of seeing what I can and can't do. I'm doing a little bit of documentation reading as well and kind of taking advantage of the tools that are available to us to kind of figure some of these things out as I need. But it's really a lot of hands-on learning. And that's just how I prefer to learn. And, figuring out as well who the subject matter experts are internally for different things. And, if I do encounter some sort of problem or issue, obviously I'm going to check with the resources that are available to me first. But then if I'm not able to find that answer, I can easily route that to the right person and figure out how to solve that. So yeah, that learning thing is number one for me. That's the number one thing in my book.
And are you pulling out the credit card and like swiping from free to paid and converting and like really trying to get into the mind of a user? Like, are you going to that depth, that level?
I'm not swiping the card. We just recently launched our starter plus plan. So before that, it was like $500 a month, but I'm on the Navattic paid plan. But I do, since, growth does encompass a lot of user journey, and especially early user journey, in the sense of, from sign up, what that experience like is to being engaged. Those are the things I'm looking for. So I am looking at, when am I encountering paywalls? I will be signing up with an email address that isn't a Navattic email address and checking out the product that way. I highly recommend doing that. If you have some sort of other business domain email or something like that, use that to sign up so you can truly get like a sense of what it's like as a new user. So those are things I'm like testing out and trying out over there and just kind of poking around. And I just continue to keep doing that. I continue to keep checking things out as new features get released, seeing how I interact with them and all of those things.
Dude, the trick for anyone listening, if you want to sign up for your tool a million times, which you will eventually do, or you should do if you're working growth, the trick is, like, let's say my email is Andrew at deliveringvalue.co. But if I wanted to sign up for a bunch of different tools, I would do Andrew plus something, like Andrew plus today's date at deliveringvalue.co. And you can do an Andrew plus and then do a different unique thing. And it creates a new entry into whatever CRM, into whatever product. And so that's been the hack for me. Like, at every company I've ever been to, I'll end up getting like 40 or 60 marketing emails. Like, when I leave, every time they send out like a newsletter or product update, and it's to all those, and I have to manually go and like unsubscribe them all. And it's a huge pain in the butt, but that's a good way to hack it if you don't have a million of those emails.
I do that as well. I can't tell you how many, like, I do, Jay Desai plus test 1 plus test 2 plus test 3. Sometimes I'll do a plus 4. I think the more mature way to do it, like, that's like the early level, but the more mature way to do it too is like, if you can add some sort of like modifier to what you're doing, like if it's like campaign or feature specific, so that way you can even remember like why I use this email and what it's like intended for, essentially. But yeah, I love that trick.
So going back to learning roadmap, you were saying top of the list is making sure that I get a little bit of depth inside of the product. What else is on the learning roadmap towards the top of the list for you?
Yeah, the other thing that is especially important for me is, especially at the early stage level, I think it's learning how people on your team work, and those that are in close proximity to you work as well. We unfortunately don't live in like silos when it comes to work. You have to interact and work with people. And truly, that's the best way to make progress, honestly. And so in that sense, I want to spend a lot of that early time to getting to know my team, my coworkers, my other peers, because those people are going to be the ones that I'm going to need to eventually rely on to complete some of my work, whether it's, reviewing something, helping to unblock something. So that's something that's like really important as well. I feel like it's really easy to go ahead and just like dive into work. And I think especially for like early stage growth, it just feels sometimes a little bit natural, especially if you've had that kind of role before. The first thing you kind of want to do is like dive into anything immediately. But I think having this be my fourth role at an earlier stage company, I think the biggest thing that I've learned is I really want to take stock of everything early on. And as much as I can kind of take stock of that, I kind of relate it to like going to the gym or like going for a walk. Like, at some point, maybe you want to go and do something that's maybe a little bit more competitive in that space. But, if you don't have the fundamentals set properly and you don't have the knowledge of those fundamentals, it just makes everything a lot more difficult down the line.
And so kind of going off of that, I'm assuming somewhere on the learning list is probably some growth model fundamentals or funnel foundations, some of the data acumen and some of that kind of stuff. Is that also on your plan, I'm assuming?
So that's like number 2. Like, so I put 1A and 1B as those first 2 things. And then number 2 is like learning what's being used, learning the tool set, what's tech stack like, where is reporting done, what kind of reporting are you going to be responsible for, what metrics are you going to be responsible for. So definitely, I think defining clarity within your existing team, and there might not be some of that, in my last role, like I said, I was the only marketer at a recruiting company that had never had a marketing function before. So there's a little bit of, you kind of have to define that yourself and do a little bit of that on your own. But figuring out some sort of discovery too, I think in taking all that, I always say, even if you're the first marketer at a company, there's never zero level of marketing. There has always been some sort of marketing that has been attempted. And maybe it's not very mature or anything like that, but businesses don't reach a point where they need to bring in and hire a marketer or even an agency potentially if they haven't tried something themselves and identified the need. Well, hopefully that's the case, because I have seen other scenarios where people just try and hire for something without actually attempting to do it themselves. But that's a whole nother set of issues that maybe is in another podcast.
All right, so to recap, we got product depth, we've got team operating system, cultural norms, we've got tool set, and we've got growth model / reporting, infrastructure, and ownership. Did I get all that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything we missed that's like high up on the learning roadmap for you first 90 days?
I think those are the biggest things. I mean, I think, there is a level of like experimentation. I think that's maybe a little bit harder to kind of quantify, and what that is essentially is like, hey, if you are responsible for working on something that maybe doesn't fit in that Goldilocks zone that I like mentioned, essentially, that will obviously always be in that learning set as well. You kind of got to figure that out and spend some time doing that. Luckily, I think today we have a lot of resources at our disposal, way more than when I haven't been in marketing a long time career-wise, but a lot more that I know than when I started that's available publicly nowadays. So definitely lean on those resources as you can to kind of fill in some of that depth. But yeah, that can always be a part of your learning process as well.
So let's talk about the second component for 90-day plan, which is trust and alignment. So for you in this role, you talked a little bit about starting to get into some of the team and cultural norms and things like that. Who are like the 3 or 5 people that are top of your list, folks that you got to build trust with during these first 90 days? And what's your plan? Like, how does somebody actually build trust, or how are you thinking about building trust in this way?
I always preface and say it really depends on what your existing team structure looks like and your organization structure looks like. So I'll preface with that. For me at Navattic, we're a team of 3 for the marketing. So I'd obviously put the other 2 marketers on our team, Meredith and Natalie, are 1A and 1B. For that, you definitely have to, learn how to work together with the people on your team. And then in kind of that close proximity section, the other places I look at, sales is really important, I think. So I always tend to prioritize the sales team and how much depth I can get into the sales team as possible. As an organization gets bigger, it might become more difficult to build those relationships across every single person in sales. But I think, for us, we have maybe a smaller sales team. So there is an opportunity to build that sort of depth with our head of sales and the account executives that are on the team. So, head of sales is super important to build that relationship with. And then a couple other places I'm looking as well. This is, I think, an underrated one is customer success. If you have a customer success leader, I think it's really important to kind of build that relationship. It's very easy to kind of go like growth. Like the thing that I'm thinking about is like, okay, how do I bring in a bunch of new users and bring in a bunch of new traffic and some of that stuff? But I think what sometimes often people forget is there's so much opportunity sitting in that existing customer base, and CS tends to have a lot of knowledge around that. And so if you can kind of build a strong relationship with your CS team, it can be extremely important for a couple of things that can be really high impact growth levers, which are 1, generating social proof around your product, customer stories, reviews, case studies, all of those things. And then 2, referrals as well can be a really big source on collaborating with customer success on working and growing, either some sort of referral or affiliate channel. The last one I'll put on the list as well, and I think this one is really size dependent above everything and depending on how your organization is structured. But for us, Natalie is our main marketing leader at the company, and she reports to the founders. So like when there's only that one level stage of removal, I think I like to make sure and have a little bit of a working relationship with the founders as well, because typically at that stage, they're not going to be like the same ICs they were to an extent, when the company was founded. but they're typically still extremely hands-on within the business. So there's a lot of things that you'll be working with them on. So those are really big, I think, in the early 90 days. And, I always say, like, as much depth as you can build through the organization as you go, you should take advantage of that, because you never know what projects you'll be working on, who you'll need help from, who you'll need to collaborate with. Those are the ones that I'd prioritize. But, I wouldn't say like that's the list. Like, I'm doing a cutoff from there. I want to truly like create a relationship with as many people as I can within the organization, because, eventually you'll need to work with people. You might need to also get favor from them for ideas that you want to push forward and things like that. So yeah.
Hey, real quick, if you've been enjoying this episode, I'm going to take a wild guess that you're a marketing, product, or growth team lead, which is also my background. And when I first started leading my very first growth team, I have never been more stressed and worked harder and longer in my career because I didn't really have the right system in place. I said yes to everything, and suddenly I was in every single meeting and all the decisions were flowing through me. And I still had my own individual contributor workload on the side. And eventually I stumbled into something that I now call my growth operating system. It's basically a plug and play framework with templates and rituals and how to structure meetings and how to create and document your strategy so that your team can move faster, you can run more experiments, you can win more without you being the bottleneck. So if any of that sounds like you and you're looking for some support, check out my growth operating system at deliveringvalue.co/OS if you want to have more impact and influence without working around the clock. It's deliveringvalue.co/OS. I'd love to hear what you think. And if we were to talk to these folks, what part of your role do you think they might misunderstand if you don't clarify it and maybe proactively address it? Because one of the big challenges that I see is like, because growth, again, is so loosely defined that your customer success person might think growth is one thing, and your marketing team might think of growth is a different thing, and your founders might think growth is something totally different. So I'm curious for you in the moment that you're in, right? I'm not internal at Navattic, so I have no insider info that I'm coaching you towards on this call, but what are the things that they might misunderstand about your role, and how can you get ahead on it?
The biggest thing that I see misalignment on from external outside of marketing is honestly the capacity that's available within the team or within a person. I think because, sales is very, I can build that sort of pipeline of my day or my quarter. Like if I generated X amount of sales and this was my conversion rate from, calls that I've taken to sales, and I can work backwards to get my it's very data driven in that sense. I think growth is a little bit, I don't know if flexibility is the right word, but there's a little bit more mushiness essentially. Like those can change very quickly, right? You might be working through a very heavy experimentation sprint. So you might have a few projects that are very time and energy consuming, whereas, maybe in another sprint, you're working more towards projects that you feel that you can complete very quickly, or maybe there's some internal enablement stuff that you're working on. There's a little bit more flexibility over there. So I think just aligning on capacity is something that I find really important early on, and just like understanding like what we're going to be working on and what we're prioritizing. And another thing that I make sure as well is how can you help surface those ideas and bring those ideas to the team? Those are some things that are like really important to help set up. And I think, growth just has a level of subjectiveness to it in terms of how things are working, but I try and create as much objectiveness as possible. So that way there are those guardrails that kind of makes it easier to work together.
So I want to double click on that a little bit more. I think about a lot of those systems and tools and expectations. And I think about a lot of that as your operating system, right? The strategy is what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, what good looks like, what KPIs you track to know if you're on track, that type of thing. Your operating system is how you go about the work. And growth tends to have its own operating system, right? Other teams typically are not trying to disrupt themselves, and they're not running lots of test cycles, and they're not collecting data in the same way that you might be on the growth team. And so you started to talk a little bit about these already in terms of setting expectations and capacity planning and things like that. What are the tools, systems, or resources that you're needing to get into place as part of your operating system first 3 months?
I have a philosophy of where I call it coloring in the lines when possible. So I'll take an evaluation of what the tech stack is internally and what tools are being used in terms of planning, organizing, all of those things. For us, Notion is really big, and I'm a big Notion user myself. So that's where I've been housing my growth projects and experiments. I think it just depends. And the reason I say coloring in the lines when possible is because I think of it the same way. And maybe this is like the growth mindset of like the challenge that growth people have for their role is just like it's difficult to get someone to adopt your product and, give them a reason of why should I do this? Why do I need to get another login and stuff like that? Or, another tool for this. I think of it in the same way. And so that's why I try and use the existing tech stack when possible, because if you're housing your information or your system in the same tools that everyone else is using, they're much more likely to participate and contribute and give feedback versus giving them another tool that they have to go in and check out. So I use Notion personally. And the way that I have that set up is I have a Notion board that has different stages that contains my projects or experiments that I'm working on. I've got a backlog, essentially, ideas that I haven't necessarily actioned on are good ideas and we want to keep saved somewhere.
And can anyone contribute to that? Is that part of like those initial combos that you were having?
Yep. Anyone can contribute to that. I've got a form actually that connects to creating new cards within my Notion board, essentially. And I've actually put in a Loom video walkthrough as well. And then for the people that want to get really in-depth and technical, I have a property glossary as well that kind of like outlines what the different fields are for. That's not really something that's necessary for people to like learn and check out. Most people are just going directly to the form. But like I mentioned earlier, people learn in different ways. So I have some of those other resources that are available. And yeah, anyone can add an idea. And then what we'll typically do is we'll review the board every week and we look to see, and I kind of organize my board in this way. I've started doing this recently. I kind of assign effort scores to each task, essentially. These are pretty subjective to an extent because there's not really an objective way to do it until you're actually like in the task maybe, or you're doing like a postmortem and you can kind of determine maybe a little bit for the next round. But the way that I think about it is I set a limit for myself in terms of tasks based on how much effort I can contribute. To give you an example, right now in these first 30 to 60 days, I'm basically on the second set of 30 days right now. So we're on the 30 to 60 area. I've set a limit of 12 effort points in any active sprint, essentially.
That's like your total capacity, so to speak?
Exactly. Yeah, that's my total capacity. So I will, mark tasks as they come in, and as we approve them, we'll have an effort score that we'll assign, essentially. And that's how I help to kind of limit my capacity. And I have that super clear laid out in my growth board. And so, if we're at 12 effort points and we have something that's approved, we're not going to start working on that until we reduce the existing workload that's available right now.
Hey, if you're enjoying the stories on this show and feeling like you're ready to tackle some of your own hurdles, I'm here to help. If you didn't know already, I offer one-to-one coaching specifically for people who work on or around growth teams who want to have a bigger influence and impact in their roles. Maybe you're navigating some tough moments, whether it's managing your team or handling feedback. Maybe you just want to step into a bigger leadership role. Or maybe you're at a unicorn company today and you want to make sure that the company doesn't outgrow your skill set. Either way, I can help. If you're interested in learning a little bit more, head to deliveringvalue.co/coaching to learn a little bit more and set up a call with me to see if we jive. All right, enough from me. Back to the episode. Dude, I love this, man. This is exactly how engineers have been working. I don't know why more marketers don't adopt this way. Seriously, engineers have it so figured out, right? If you ask an engineer, hey, can you squeeze this thing in? They're like, yeah, you just got to drop one of these other things. But then if you ask a marketer that same question, hey, can you squeeze this thing in? They're like, I'll find a way to make it happen. And so I love that you're doing this. Do you teach other people? Is that part of this rollout plan? Are you educating people? Here's how my sprint planning works. Here's my total units available for work. Here's how I pull things over. If you got something new, I'll evaluate. Like, are you teaching people how you're making decisions?
I make it as easy as possible. And so how that works, making it as easy as possible, is as ideas are added to that backlog, and we review every week, like where we're at in terms of total capacity, what's in our approved, what can we move over. As things move through that funnel, essentially, people get notified on where their project is in the stage, essentially. And with that email, there's information around, hey, congratulations, your project's moved on to this stage. Here's what this stage means. When something gets moved to that approved stage, there's information around like your project will get moved to the approved stage once we have enough capacity that's open. Here's what the definition of capacity is. Once it's in progress, there's another notification that goes to the internal stakeholders, as I say, essentially, and it lets them know their project's in progress. That's when, we have capacity and that project is now being worked on, essentially. And then it provides them with what's going to happen next. Your project is going to fall into one of three categories. It's either going to be completed, and those are for projects that are kind of like one-off or have some sort of end goal in mind. Think of that as like maybe like, I don't know, building out a dashboard, like something internal enablement, or building out a specific workflow that, hey, we know like this is very specific, and once we build this, we probably won't have very many edits or something like that. The other ways that a project can go is either paused, and those are for projects that, we defined a window of time that we're going to be running this experiment essentially, and there's not enough of a conclusive outcome for us to continue working on this. And typically what I'll assign that is there'll be some sort of time period that's established for 30 to 60 days after that project is essentially completed, that we'll see, was this project effective? Should we continue to keep working on this? And if not, it's going to go into pause. And then the other outcome that can happen is, in that time period after we complete the project and, it's something that we want to potentially roll out or consider rolling out, experimenting a little bit. The other bucket that I fall in is a scaled bucket. And so projects that fall into there, projects that were successfully scaled, they aren't necessarily one-off projects, but there's something that continues to run in the background, essentially.
So I love this. I love the process here. How do you know if this is working? Right? So like if we fast forward, you're setting this system up. It's a new system, right? So it's something that you're bringing in, that you're implementing, that's going to be a part of you scaling your influence and your impact here. How do you know if it needs to be iterated on or if it's perfect?
Yeah. So I think really early on, I try and define some sort of metric around the project. And that's part of what my intake is originally. And if, as people submit projects, sometimes they'll provide information on what success looks like. Sometimes there's not necessarily a metric around success, but I'll try and create some sort of definition for success. So thinking about just through some of my early projects that I'm working on right now, like I mentioned, one of the things is, I'm working a lot on our content process, right? So in that sense, there's a little bit of like subjectiveness in the sense of we're not trying to build right now a content system that's like just churning out like one piece every single day and like doing that sort of like level of scale, because we want to really, for right now, we want to make sure that our scale is essentially, hey, are we able to do these projects, these content pieces faster with the same level of detail that we've had previously? So that's kind of what we're looking at. And so what that turns into is, we think about how much time were we spending on doing this activity before? That's our baseline metric, essentially. And then we'll set some sort of like goal objective. And, maybe like an example is like, maybe it took us like 2 hours or 3 hours of time this week to work on this project, or however it's kind of defined. And we want to maybe move that down into 1 hour, right? Because that time savings at scale is pretty significant. 1 hour a week, talking about 52 weeks, that's basically a whole week of work essentially that you're getting back every year. And so that might be one way of goal setting over there. And so we'll define that early on as we're kind of building out whatever is needed to support that project or experiment. And then once that task is essentially completed, we align on what type of time period we're going to let this experiment run for. That could be all the way up to, I try and typically cap up to 90 days max, because, if you're still running an experiment after 90 days and you're not able to have any sort of conclusive evidence on whether this is or is not working, it's probably time to pause that experiment and focus on some higher priority tasks that maybe you can actually tell some sort of definitive outcome. So we'll assign a time window. There is a level of arbitrariness to it, but not really. It's kind of rooted in previous experiments, experience, and background and those types of things. And so we'll assign that. And then we want to see, like, were we able to move that metric in the direction that we wanted to? Is there, as we get to that end of that experiment window, are we getting closer to that metric, or is it just kind of just hanging out there? Maybe it's improving one week, maybe it's not improving the next week. What is it looking like? And from that point, as we decide to pause something or scale something, if we have, and we're still making edits throughout that process, right? It's not like we're just going to let the project just sit there and figuring out if there's an opportunity for us. And we kind of like, this is where a little bit of like gut and experience comes into factor over here. But you want to keep testing and seeing like, can we make a couple of maybe tweaks over here that initially came out? Same thing as like, to your point, product and engineering, right? They release a feature, maybe something's a little bit broken or didn't work as expected. You want to make that change and ship it out as quick as possible. And yeah, we'll see how it works. Did it move the needle? And then we'll kind of make a determination off of that. So just adding a level of science layer to this.
So that makes sense at the project level. But what about at the operating system level? That's kind of what I was curious about. Is for you, you're implementing this whole system, right? In Notion, you've got your different ways of categorizing the projects, different ways of taking in projects. You've got your different units of work that you're communicating out to others. You're working in sprint cycles. You're scoring things based on your effort, all that kind of stuff, communicating outwards based on your goals and your intended outcomes. You're, pivoting, all that good stuff. How do you know if that system is working?
I think it really connects back to the projects that you're able to point to. You want to make sure that there's a good level of alignment. And I think there's a couple of ways to do that. I think one, it's important to reflect after you complete projects, making sure you kind of score those. There might be some level of scoring change that happened on an individual project level basis, but I think that rolls up to essentially the whole system, right? If you're not having some sort of kind of like post-mortem as you're completing these projects and you're just taking things as face value, you want to kind of make sure that you're updating those and kind of reviewing that, writing down any sort of next steps, learnings, insights, all those things, documentation. Those are the things that are going to help you improve that system and then kind of make optimizations and tweaks on that. But I think it's really going to be a hands-on type of process. And I think like as you complete more projects and experiments, and as you do those postmortems and you update the effort scores on each of those projects that you're doing, the impact scores. So those are the two things that I score each project on, is effort and impact. And then you can see how much impact you've generated, right? We can even track that to an extent, right? If we worked on, for easy math, 10 projects throughout the quarter, and, each of those had an average of 3 out of 5 impact or something like that, we'd be able to say, at the end of the quarter, we had 30 impact points. How do we know that that's working? We're going to review with the team and see, like, did this truly create this level of impact that we were anticipating at the full growth level? And then the other thing to consider is, maybe there's a level of optimization for tasks for the next quarter as we kind of look through, okay, maybe we got 30 impact points this quarter. Can we go for 35 and do like a little bit of like an increase essentially and see if we can generate more impact? And then, as we're doing our postmortem on these tasks or on this quarter, figuring out, hey, was the impact score that we thought we created, was that what we expected, right? So if we're going for a 35 impact score and we had a 30 impact score for the last quarter, and we truly feel like we hit our objectives, was this actually, in this case, 20% higher, essentially, or whatever the math comes out for that? Like, was that actually that much more generated impact? If not, maybe we need to rework and reconfigure how we think about that. But those are how I'm thinking about those things.
It sounds like what you've got is some way to grade the system. And so your grade is based on the impact that you're able to have, or your hit rate might be a different way to look at it. But that to me makes a lot of sense. Yeah, having something like that seems really important. I like that yours is quantitative. Probably there's a qualitative aspect to it as well. And maybe it's insinuated but unspoken type of a thing where you do like a little bit of a retro where you ask the folks who you're working with, who you're getting inputs from, who you're giving updates to for some of that qualitative feedback as well. And I feel like those two things to me are all that you can do when you're thinking about creating systems and adjusting them as time goes on.
Yeah. And I think the really important thing is figuring out how you can connect that qualitative back to a quantitative. Like, there is a level of subjectiveness that is involved, but it's really easy to kind of point to say like, hey, like we were maybe even able to get more efficient in terms of our capacity or something like that as time has gone on, or we've done a better job. We've improved picking more higher impact tasks than we did the last quarter or something like that. Those are some ways that you can kind of tie back that qualitative to that quantitative, which really, I think, helps to kind of just paint that story of what you're doing.
So, dude, during our conversation today, you've talked about quick wins in a few different categories, both identifying them up front, kind of balancing them with some bigger bets and longer term initiatives. For you, thinking about your first 90 days, what percentage of your time do you think you should be spending on quick wins versus everything else you got to do during the first 90 days? If we could think about this like a pie chart, what does the pie chart look like for percentage time implementing and optimizing these quick wins?
Yeah, I think for me, where I want to be really playing at is I want to be, and this might be a little bit high and we could kind of talk through it, but I prefer to spend about 70 to 80%. And this kind of trails off. Like, so this is like a moving average, I would say, to an extent. It's not going to be the same pie chart that it was on day 30 that it is on day 90. But if we're looking at an overall average of time, essentially, I want to spend anywhere between 70 to 80% of my time on either learnings or quick wins, and then the other 20 to 30% on experimentation. I think that tends to change as you get through, especially at a startup, an early stage startup. You've kind of just got to naturally move faster. And I think that those percentages start to change as you get closer to the end of the 90 days. And they're maybe even higher at the beginning of the first 90 days. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about that process. My goal in those first 90 days is to create as much trust and impact as I can as possible. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about that is, there are a lot of opportunities to kind of boil at the beginning. And I think the reality, and sometimes you got to make sure and take a step back and look at this, is like, usually the role that you're coming into exists because the company feels like they're at a point where they need this person to be able to do this function or have some of these sort of skills. So they are looking for a level of impact. But I think the reality that some growth people also don't maybe consider is like, not everything is like the house is on fire at the same time. And the reality is like, if you weren't doing some of these things, or maybe there's a different person like that was in your shoes that has a different set of skills that's maybe doing that same set of growth role. So you kind of just have to consider the level of like urgency, I guess, to those tasks and think about how can you balance to truly create that level of impact that you want to do. And that's why I like to just focus on a lot of those quick wins and learnings early, is because, and this is maybe something that all growth people think about, or maybe it's just me, but I always feel like I'm like the high that want to do like more and get more done and do all that stuff. But I got to always take a step back and think that, if I wasn't in this role, or if there was someone else, maybe it's not getting done the same way that if I was there, or if someone else was there in those shoes. So I think that can kind of just help to ground you in terms of how you're focusing on things. And I think there is a level of importance and something that you should just consider on what taking in those first 90 days and taking a step back where you can to really like analyze what's going on and understand what you're doing, how you're doing, having the right things in place, having those right relationships in place can make that much big of an outsized impact down the line for those next 270 days, right? The rest of the year, there's still 3/4 for that full year. So just, I think, something to consider there.
And if I could add anything to that, I would add for anybody listening to this, I think one of the best things that you can do in the first couple of weeks is to let everyone know that percentage. Hey, in my first couple of weeks, I'm going to be spending X amount of my time focused on quick wins, but longer term, I'm going to be shifting that in this way. And here's why. And typically what I find is a lot of folks who come in for new roles, especially growth roles, right? Like we want to come in, we want to make a quick impact. We want to prove everybody right for hiring us. But if we're not careful, and we don't set aside the time to do the longer term foundational work, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, we can end up in this place where we just jump from quick win to quick win to quick win, but we never make that big impact that we want to really have at the end of the year, or, we want to have just in general in our role. So I think one of the best ways you can get ahead on that is just to go lean in on ultra clarity and ultra transparency and let everybody know, hey, from the jump, here's what I'm going to be doing. Here's how that's going to shift over time. And then if anybody wants to chat about how you're prioritizing your time, you can have that conversation, which is a more strategic conversation than just by asking like, hey, when can this get done? Or like, why didn't we do this? Or how come we haven't done this instead we're doing that? So I love leaning in on the transparency side.
That's a great point. I think, we can do a better job of communicating that. And I think that's something that every growth person should consider. I think you're totally right.
And so we want to balance these quick wins with these longer term strategic foundational big swings. And so let's double click on that for a little bit, right? So the fifth element here is some of these longer term foundational stuff. When should somebody reasonably be expected to share the first version of their strategy? Like, when are you thinking about that? Obviously, you're working on quick wins. You're gathering this information. You're doing research about the product, about the customer. You're understanding the growth model. At some point, you're working towards a place where you're going to say, here's what I'm working on. Here's what good's going to look like. Here's what I need to get there. When do you plan on doing that? When do you think is a realistic time frame?
I think it very much depends on when you're joining in this role and what competing priorities are going around at the company. So I will preface that. I think for me, how I'm kind of thinking about this is I started my role basically at the beginning of November of 2025. What's nice about this starting point is, 2026 is right around the corner. People are thinking about planning for the next year and making some of those longer term bets, some of those longer term strategies, putting them in place or at least doing the groundwork for that. So where I'm thinking about this is I'm thinking about this very much in the maybe like 45 to like 70-day mark for me. I think like in terms of why I'm thinking about that, it's because we are pretty close to like quarterly or like, annual planning essentially that's coming up. And so I'm going to be with the rest of the marketing team in New York in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be kind of working on that plan. And that's going to be around my 45-day mark. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about that. We have like a slower period essentially during that holiday season, as most marketers tend to have to some degree. It's never truly slow, but at least, you don't have conferences that you're competing for, any sort of other events that have people involved in that process. But that's what I'm thinking. But I think, just idealistically, like thinking about any sort of start, I would say probably around like the 60 to 90-day mark is maybe where you want to start thinking about some of those long-term bets and strategies. I think maybe even closer. You want to have that fleshed out and put together for sure when you hit that 90-day mark. I think like you need to have that not only put together, but also maybe have that reviewed by someone else by that point to make sure, there is some degree of alignment that exists. So that's what I would like suggest and kind of look at. And with two caveats, the first one I mentioned before was, it depends on the timing of things when you join and what competing priorities are there. And then the second caveat is being those things can change. Like just make sure you build enough flexibility in whatever you're putting together from like a long-term strategy that allows for things to potentially change and to allow yourself to take advantage of potential opportunities that could be presented. You don't want to create some sort of long-term strategy or plan where you're fully like locked into something else and you can't be quick enough to pivot and make those decisions. So that's like the other caveat I have to this piece.
All right, Jay. So if we fast forward here, you and I catch up at the end of 2026, and you tell me any story that isn't, dude, I fucking crushed it this year. If you tell me a version of a story that isn't that, what would be the most likely thing that could derail your success as you get going in this gig? And how should you think about planning for that or getting ahead on it in your first 90 days?
I think there's a couple of things that can derail a really good plan. Maybe like two or three. I'll see how I can kind of distill this. One of those things for sure is just picking the wrong projects or experiments, right? You've got an understanding of what the product is, what you're selling, what you're offering. You have an understanding of what skills you have and what you can provide and bring to the table. And you're going to try and figure out which projects to take on and which ones to kind of set aside. Picking the wrong set of those projects can make a really big impact. So that can be something that can really derail a plan very fast. The other thing I think that can derail a plan really fast is making sure you don't have the right guardrails in terms of capacity restraints. I think, as you mentioned too, growth is a very ambiguous role to an extent, and it's very easy for people, to your point, people will come to you and have projects and experiments that they want you to run. And it's very easy and tempting to say, especially early on, like, oh yeah, I'll take that on. I'll add it to my plate. And if you take on too much from a capacity standpoint, I think one of two things, or maybe both, end up happening. One is either you're not able to do those jobs or those projects or those experiments at your full 100% level that you want to, because you're just juggling at that point and you're playing around with too many projects or experiments. And so you're not able to do anything really well. I kind of compare it like in sports, like why it's important to at some point prioritize and pick one lane that you want to work on, or like pick one sport that you want to do. So that way you can really focus on that and be really good at that. And the other outcome that can happen in those situations too is you just get burnt out. Like, honestly, that could be really bad. If you burn yourself out too quickly, it's easy to come out of the gates like firing and wanting to get stuff done, especially at a startup. But what you want to avoid is, just burning yourself out. I've done that to myself in previous roles too, where not necessarily at the beginning of a role, but, at different points throughout the role, there can be times where you just really push yourself a little bit more than you can. You kind of burn out. And what that causes also is you're just inefficient in terms of the projects that you're working on. Maybe you get a little bit of tunnel vision too. That can create a lot of problems. So those are the two big things that can derail a really good plan. And then maybe the third thing, I think, which I hope is not the case, is you just didn't have the skills that matched up for what needed to be done. And hopefully that's not the scenario that you're ending up in, but that can definitely be a realistic challenges. There's maybe a misalignment of expectations where the people around you or the people above you are expecting a certain level of tasks to be carried out or focused in certain direction. And there's just a mismatch in terms of your skills. So hopefully it's not the last one.
But dude, sometimes that happens and it's nobody's fault, right? And this is one of the things for anybody listening to this, I see this all the time where they hire somebody great. The person's excited for the role, the company's excited for the person, and then the person gets in there. Maybe they're a growth marketer and they realize, geez, this company really needs a product growth expert, or they hire an amazing growth PM and it's like, well, they really needed someone who really understands acquisition in a deep way, or they hire a head of growth, but really it's too soon. And what they really need is somebody just to execute in one of those different lanes. And sometimes the company doesn't know and the person isn't able to suss it out in the interview process. And it happens to the best of us. And so if that happens to you or to anybody who's listening to this, it's nobody's fault. At some point, we're all taking the best educated guess we can with the information we've got. And so part of the interview process, both sides kind of gathering information to see if it's the right context, need, fit. Sometimes we get it wrong, right? That's why when you look around, so many growth roles, people hop around every 12, 18 months. Sometimes it's because they just naturally leave or they get a better opportunity. Sometimes it was just the wrong fit from the beginning and it took a while for folks to notice.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to your point, I think that's why communication is so important. Like you talked about communicating with your team, like this is what I'm going to be working on. These are the percentage splits. I think communicating as well, like, hey, here are the things I'm really strong at. These are why I picked the projects or experiments I'm working on. And then figuring out that piece, right? Like I consider everything to be like, especially just go to market as a whole. It's like a giant puzzle. You've got different pieces. They're for different parts. They do different things. People, to your point, can be really strong in one area and maybe they're weaker in another. But I think getting ahead of some of those problems or challenges and being like, hey, maybe if I don't have that skill set for that, maybe do I have some budget or something that I can maybe find someone that can help to assist with that, right? Like it doesn't have to be a full-time person. It could be a consultant. It could be a mentor, something that can maybe help to color in some of those gaps essentially to avoid that. And it's, growth is really just a big problem solving position. It is really what it is you have a list of problems, things that, questions or things that people are looking to solve, and you've got to come up with the right solution for that. And, it doesn't always have to be on yourself. And that's inherently the growth role is you've got to figure out what are the right tools. And, if I need to go out and find another tool for this, making sure you're doing that as well.
All right, Jay. Well, I think you're well on your way, man. Hopefully that last one doesn't happen to you. And if it does, again, sometimes you get it wrong. We pivot, we hire resources, we find better fits, all good stuff. Thank you for coming on the show and talking through the 90-day plan, man.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.